It's my pleasure to introduce my friend and my colleague, Adam Rose. As I mentioned, all of the bios are with you already, so I'm not going to go into it too much. But Adam is certainly our resident expert on risk and economic analyses and the threats that various emergencies create. In fact, we have a center called CREATE, and Adam is certainly part of it. So without further ado, Adam, I'm going to turn to you. Look forward to your presentation.
So I'm happy to be here today to share some of the research my colleagues and I at the CREATE Center have been doing on the economics of disasters. So CREATE now stands for the Center for Risk and Economic Analysis of Threats and Emergencies. And this is a change that we enacted last summer in the name. It used to be Economic Analysis of Terrorism Events, but we wanted to convey the breadth of our research that we've actually been doing for the 17 years of our existence. The 21st century has experienced some unprecedented disasters in terms of type and magnitude, and these may just be omens of things to come. We've got several new threats that have taken place, the pandemic, COVID pandemic, unprecedented in terms of the number of deaths, and also, unfortunately, political tensions, which filter down to the local level. We have a number of insidious threats, not just airline attacks like 9/11, but what we call CBRN, chemical, bio, rad, and nuke attacks, which spread fear and major expense, and climate change, which promises a set of very constant emergencies. So I want to focus on the key role of resilience and adaptation, mainly resilience. And one of the things that this conjures up is that the fact that we'd like to mitigate or prevent all the threats I just mentioned, but we're not going to be able to do so. And so the question is, how do we best cope with the threats that do arise? And one of the things that we can do is to begin in terms of perspective is to refocus on asset services and lives lost. So historically, the focus in disasters has been on property damage, but many of the recent disasters really have little property damage involved. Pandemics was pretty minimal. Major power outages, which are increasing, cyber attacks, supply chain disruptions, very little, by the way, of property damage. We want to refocus on asset services and lives. And so what we mean here is that it's the flow of goods and services from property or assets that really adds to material well-being. These are usually measured in terms of gross domestic product or employment. We also want to emphasize improvisation and lasting strategies. And finally, we want to consider equity of underrepresented groups in terms of both the impacts and the countermeasures that we take to deal with disruptions. So I thought it'd be enlightening to compare several of the major disasters that have taken place in the 21st century. That's the first 6 of these, and then look at 4 others that we've simulated as potential. And so these are, most every one of these are events that CREATE researchers have studied. So in terms of COVID-19, we're talking about a loss of $6 trillion in GDP, sort of a major hit on the US economy on the order of more than 10% over the 2-year period, and 1 million lives lost. California wildfires in 2018, the worst year, was on the order of 100 billion, both within the state and ripple effects throughout the nation, much lower toll on lives lost. COVID-19 was even twice as big as the Great Recession. And as you can see, 40 times the size of September 11. On the other hand, climate change, we expect to lose as much as $100 billion annually in terms of GDP. And that's not just 1 year, but it's continuously throughout the rest of this century. We also have some simulated earthquakes, simulated events that are likely to take place, one of them being the shakeout earthquake that many of you at local level have been familiar with in terms of role-playing exercises. This is better known as the big one. and this could have an impact of 90 billion in terms of GDP, almost the size of Katrina. Perhaps the largest event is a severe winter storm, one of these atmospheric river storms, which could, in fact, cause $300 billion losses in GDP, most of them in California. And finally, events such as an anthrax attack, where we simulated one in Seattle that would cause 70,000 foreclosures. So to analyze the consequences of disasters, we've developed a disaster consequence analysis framework, and it builds on old-fashioned economic impact analysis that many of you know when somebody wants to build a new factory in your area or a new water treatment plant. What are the number of direct and indirect jobs created? So we have a disaster event scenario, leads to loss of life and direct economic impacts. And usually there is some economy-wide model, such as input-output or REMI model or computable general equilibrium, that captures the indirect or multiplier effects, and that gives us the total impacts. Well, we realized very soon that the disaster domain is much different, that we need to include other considerations. So one of them is resilience, which are ways that we can cope better with disasters in order to use our resources more efficiently and recover more quickly, and also behavioral linkages, which relate to fear and exaggerated responses that cost money. And these are factored in to the analysis, and we get a better picture of total economic impacts. So let me just go over three categories of disasters that we might be facing in the near term. One of them is the unthinkable, these chem, bio, rad, and nuke attacks. And we simulated a dirty bomb attack in downtown LA. And it turned out that the biggest factor affecting the results was the fear of contamination, which through the social amplification of risk and stigma effects has immense impacts. And so this relates to people who work in this area needing a premium salary to come back, sort of hazard pay, investors requiring a higher rate of return, businesses having to reduce their profit margins because they need to provide subsidies or lower their prices to attract people. Turned out that these behavioral losses were 15 times the ordinary brick and mortar and business interruption losses due to just cordoning the area off for 30 to 90 days to decontaminate it. So the keys to recovery in this case are improved decontamination effectiveness, something local government can be involved in, and also improved risk communication to reduce the fear. The inevitable disaster or set of disasters is climate change, and the consensus is that this is really happening at an accelerating pace. And so we have both increased short-term climate variability in terms of the magnitude and severity of storms, droughts, and wildfires. And we also have chronic long-term issues in terms of sea level rise, heat stress, vector-borne diseases. So the keys here are adaptation and mitigation and resilience in order to cope with this. And finally, the new normal, the pandemic isn't necessarily going away. It may continue in various forms, and governments at all levels have a key role in containing the disease spread, but that has major implications for the economy, as we've seen. We've had the economy closed down for quite a long time, and now we're opening it up. So other strong influences, we did some studies of the impacts of COVID-19 on the US economy and found that most of the major influences were these behavioral consequences and resilience. So behavioral effects in terms of mandatory closures and voluntary closures where people stayed away from the workplace, didn't send their kids to school, didn't go to retail establishments, didn't take public transit. All of this had a negative effect on the economy. On the other hand, resilience in the form of telework or supply chain workarounds had some offsetting effect for that. So let me focus on disaster resilience, and there are several interpretations, and one refers to any action that reduces hazard losses. But there's a perfectly good word for actions taken before the event, and that's mitigation. I think the best use of resilience is to refer to actions taken after the disaster strikes. But that acknowledges that resilience is a process where you can build up resilience capacity beforehand by stockpiling critical materials, holding emergency drills, identifying backup locations, purchasing portable generators. But these tactics are not implemented until after the disaster begins. So some people might say, well, how do you reduce property damage after the ground shaking has taken place or the floodwaters have risen? Well, you can't. But the other dimension of the cost of disasters is business interruption. And this just starts when the disaster strikes until it continues until you've recovered. And so you have all this time to be able to reduce those losses. And essentially in this context, resilience is synonymous with business continuity. So let me telescope in even more and talk a little bit about economic resilience. So I've studied resilience in about 10 disciplines: ecology, organizational behavior, planning, etc., and found more commonalities than differences among the definitions. So the static definition of resilience in general is the ability of a system to maintain function when shocked, to operate in some way. And the economic definition is the efficient use of remaining resources at a given point in time to produce as much as possible. So this gets at the heart of economics, which is the science of scarcity, and resources become even more scarce in the context of a disaster. The dynamic definition is a counterpart which focuses on the efficient use of resources over time for investment in repair and reconstruction. We've also developed an operational metric, and that for a given resilience tactic refers to losses presented by the use of that tactic as a percent of potential losses without implementing it. I've got a numerical example from 9/11, but I'm just going to highlight the bottom line. We found that 72% of potential losses, direct potential losses in 9/11, were prevented by the rapid relocation of businesses in the aftermath of the Twin Tower attacks. What are resilience tactics? Well, they're mainly ways of coping with critical input disruptions, whether it's employees or lack of facility or various types of material inputs. And these shouldn't be very surprising to you. They are actions such as conserving on those scarce resources, substituting inputs, using inventories, excess capacity, relocating, etc. One of them that may not be familiar is production recapture, which means if you have a power outage of 2 days, you can make up a lot of the lost production because you don't necessarily have your factory damaged. You simply can start up and work overtime and extra shifts. And I might also say that there are some special resilience tactics for some of our more specialized analyses, such as port disruptions, where tactics such as ship rerouting are very powerful. What we've done at Create is develop 2 decision support software tools to address these disasters in terms of analyzing the economic consequences and how best to cope with them in terms of resilience. And so this is what we refer to as our economic consequence analysis tool, or ECAT, sponsored by DHS, and it's intended to give you rapid turnaround information about the severity of a disaster, so in terms of economics. So you know how severe it is. That may help local and federal agencies decide how to allocate resources, how to get the economy back on its feet. And we've in fact developed 9 of the modules. We eventually intend to develop 30 of these for a wider set of threats, but you can see the 3 categories here. And so all the user needs to do is hit one of these of their choice for the case in point, decide what kind of uncertainty display you want. The very simplest is a point estimate, or you can get an entire distribution. Hit go and you get some results. So this is the Maritime cyber port disruption, where you key in the loss of $136 billion of trade, which might result, let's say, from a 30-day shutdown of the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. The default values have no resilience, no behavioral linkages, but you can see that the average GDP loss estimate for the US as a whole is on the order of $122 billion, or it's slightly less than 1%. So in percentage terms, it doesn't sound so big, but it's $122 billion. In terms of job losses on an annualized basis, that's 257,000 jobs, and quite a bit. So what we do typically, though, is we look at the gray areas mean the time of day that this disaster strikes, because it's not just an earthquake that's momentary, but long term. These background factors aren't pertinent in this type of disruption, but resilience definitely is, in terms of the extent of inventories of the customers of the ports, the extent of ship rerouting, the extent of production recapture, and the extent that businesses conserve on material inputs that are not forthcoming to them. A second decision support tool that we have developed is the Business Resilience Calculator. And I've got some references to all of this, but you simply key in your search engine resiliencecalculator.com. You can bring up a pilot version of this, and it's intended to help businesses identify and assess the extent of their resilience and help them set targets for improving it. And so we start with the business keying in what the disruption is in terms of the major causes. Then they're given a set of resilience tactics, such as the table I showed you earlier, and then to identify which of those that they actually tend to use. And then they're given a score of their likely resilience capability in relation to best practices. And so the median benefit cost ratio for a tactic like production recapture is on the order of 8.15, which means you get a return of 8 times the amount you invest in production recapture, which might be paying overtime. And then you have the fact that almost 10% of the firms were best practice firms did in fact have a return on that investment of over 50. And so you can compare yourself and ask, well, how do I get to a higher level of resilience in the process? So just to conclude, we have many new threats that require new approaches to recovery. Greater emphasis on risk communication to dispel fear, not only of CBRN, but other types of threats, including wildfire, including pandemics. On terms of our short-term response, that's mainly what I refer to as resilience to sort of climate variability and extremes and disasters. But it's important that we learn lessons from these short-term responses in a cumulative fashion and build our knowledge base. And then we have long-term adaptation to chronic problems that we're going to be facing, such as sea level rise or higher temperatures as well. We've developed some economic analysis tools that should be useful in estimating the consequences and evaluating recovery options in terms of both government and business. And governments at all levels have important roles in all of this, especially in terms of improved risk communication, but also in terms of facilitating private sector self-motivated resilience. So we can depend on the private sector just in terms of business survival to rally and implement a lot of these tactics. And we would like to see government partnership with business in this way, rather than government duplicating or getting in the way. And so government can facilitate private sector resilience by things like reducing paperwork and various restrictions during the recovery from a disaster. So my last slide, and I hope this will be posted, is a set of studies that we've performed on many of these. This is the link to the business resilience calculator. This is the Seattle anthrax attack. This is the this is the dirty bomb attack. The Trade Center attack is down here, and more recently, the COVID-19 attack. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Adam. While I guess I'll wait to hear from Ashley whether or not there are any questions, but this is wonderful, and I thank you for this last slide. We'll share it with everyone, because I think what happens most of the time, especially with the folks who are online with us right now, the special district, local government officials, etc., a lot of them are siloed and don't tap into this kind of research as well as this kind of information. So you sharing all of that, I think, is critical and very important. So while I'm waiting, if there are any other questions, but what I wanted to ask you is, while you did say what's the role of government, how do you see governments, especially in this case, special district and local government municipalities, how do you see the interaction with our universities, and whether or not you have advice for them as to how they can interact with our universities, in particular, to be able to take this less silo-like approach to something that affects us all?
Sure. Well, there are several ways. One, we have a lot of experts at universities who would be happy to come to speak to local government agencies about the work we're doing to provide a broader perspective on various kinds of disasters and emergency management in general. We have tools that are essentially free at this point. The two that I showed you, and there's still others that you can actually use, and we can provide a little bit of help in terms of learning how to use them. But they're intended to be very user-friendly and simple and straightforward. And then digging into our research, those papers are out there for free. You can readily read them. And finally, we stand ready to engage in research projects with government agencies. Sometimes smaller ones can be done pro bono, but the larger ones have to be done with some contracting. But I might say our overhead is a lot lower than the consulting firms, and we are considered objective, honest brokers in these things and have a lot of credibility in terms of our analyses.
Indeed. Thank you for that, Adam. I think that's critical. Does the tool include earthquake scenarios? If yes, what are the inputs and outputs?
All right. So the tool does include earthquakes, and that's one of the ones that are operating. And the way we did this was we have a very large model, a complexity model that we ran, changing various parameters based on real world and simulated earthquake events. And we changed things like the magnitude of the earthquake, the extent of resilience tactics, the time of day that the ground shaking took place. And we varied these, ran 500 to 1,000 simulations. And this model is so complex, you can't put it in a user-friendly piece of software. But we used all the results there, where the results were things like the GDP impacts, the employment impacts, those are the outputs, and ran a regression through those 500 to 1,000 observations. So that simple regression equation is what's contained in the software. And so there's a book, the ECAT book there, that you can just tap on the link and obtain for free, and it lays everything out for you.
That's great. The next question is it possible to add solar storms?
Well, I'd really like to do that, because that's one of those unprecedented events in terms of magnitude. And I think there haven't been that many large ones that have raised havoc. I think there was one in Quebec in the last 30 years, but we'd love to do that. I can't say that's our next priority, but eventually we hope to do so. And if anybody out there sees a pressing need for that, especially the utilities, which are most likely to be affected, we'd be happy to work with you on it.
That's great. I see no more questions. Adam, I'm grateful for your coming and speaking.
Sure.
You're a great friend. Anytime I ask, you're there. Very much appreciated. And I hope that folks take you up on it and actually engage you and the center, for that matter, for any kind of future research and or possibilities of collaboration. So thank you, Adam.
All right. Right. Feel free to reach out to me. I've got a very simple email address, adam.rose@usc.edu. Thank you, Frank, for inviting me. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Adam.